Our second look inside the Netflix binge-watched hit Making a Murderer. The lead prosecutor makes the case against Steven Avery and what he claims the Making a Murder series gets wrong. That's today on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. In his 25-year prosecution career, Ken Kratz has handled many complex and high-profile cases, including homicides, sexual assaults, child abuse cases, property crimes. He's dedicated his career, in fact, to advancing the rights of crime victims and for his work on the Teresa Halbach murder case, which was the murder Steven Avery was convicted of. He was named Prosecutor of the Year by the Wisconsin Association of Homicide Investigators in 2008. Ken's new book, Avery, The Case Against Steven Avery and What Making a Murderer Gets Wrong. Making a Murderer, a 10-part Netflix series, was filmed over 10 years following the Steven Avery case, from false imprisonment for 18 years for a rape he didn't commit to a conviction for a murder that's generated a lot of controversy. And there is going to be a second season of Making a Murderer upcoming. Welcome, Ken. Good to talk to you.
Thanks very much for having me, Jim. Appreciate it.
By the way, you and I have something in common. We're both owners of the Green Bay Packers. I'm a collector, right? I grew up as a Bears fan, but I'm a collector, and they were offering these, shares, and I bought one for my collection, and it's the biggest ripoff on shareholder democracy. I can't sell it, I can't trade it, but
you're stuck. Yeah, you're stuck with it. That's pretty much. Actually, we only do that for the Bear fans, though, Jim.
That's right. I got it.
Right. For everybody else, we have a secondary market, but not for the Bear fans.
So they're a lot smarter than I am up there.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, starting right off, do you think the series, the way it was put together, sort of breeds a perception of innocence of Steven Avery? And with that, do you think the objective of the show was really to show the unfairness of the legal system to those without resources rather than an exact recitation of a homicide?
Well, the series itself is nowhere near objective. Those that have watched it with a more critical view, that is, those that aren't sucked in by the compelling story, which is very compelling, or by the slick way in which it was made, realize that this is an advocacy piece. It's not a documentary at all. It's made by and for the defense. Steven Avery and his lawyers, both his civil lawyers and his criminal lawyers, assisted in making this production. It is very, very well done. I'm always very congratulatory of the filmmakers for having made such a nice piece, but it's not true. It didn't happen that way. It is full of omissions, and I'm very, very critical of the Netflix piece. I'm hoping that as people listen to me and others talk, read my book, and delve into the facts of the case, they will see that this is, right next to pure fiction and is nothing that I'm sure you and I grew up thinking documentaries were all about.
It's interesting. I think they did a good job on showing how tough the justice system is if you lack resources or from the wrong side of the tracks. But you build, particularly in your book, a completely compelling case that on the decision of whether he's guilty or innocent, it's pretty evident, or it seems evident, that he's not innocent of it.
Well, here's the problem, Jim. I mean, Steven Avery got a $400,000 civil settlement. So if we're talking about people without resources, not that many people have $400,000 to pay for lawyers. And so to suggest or to prop him up as the poster child for what it looks like when there aren't any resources is absurd. He got two of the very best lawyers, not just in Wisconsin, but in the country, in presenting his defense. So to, on top of that, also be able to shroud yourself in this poor Steven Avery narrative is disingenuous at the least.
Did you called yourself in the book, and you certainly tended to come off this way, as the chief villain in the piece. Did that bother you? How much did it bother you? And two, why didn't you cooperate more with them?
Well, it bothered me at the time I watched it. I've certainly come to accept it. Myself, officers Link and Colburn and Fassbender and Uyghur to a lesser extent were cast as villains in the case. They, in my opinion at least, wanted to portray me as very arrogant and as having no ethics and things of the like, which isn't very fun to watch. You realize that you're being shown exactly what the filmmakers want you to see. Then it becomes a little bit clearer. Having said all of that, Jim, it is incredibly difficult to convince millions of people that they've been fooled by a documentary and a book, as terrific a medium as that is, probably isn't going to get the word out to the extent that is necessary for people to flip the narrative back to kind of what it used to be, and that is when people believed, the cops and prosecutors were generally the good guys, that the murderers were generally the bad guys, and that justice usually prevails when you have this much evidence and you present it in a very clear and compelling way to a jury. They convict him, and then it isn't until 10 or 11 years later when this movie comes out that the whole thing is stood up on its ear. So, it's a hard thing to watch, but it's something that I think I've come to accept pretty well.
Good points. Let me ask you about this. There's that press conference you give where you say, Brendan Dassey has now confessed, and we know she was tortured and raped. Her throat was slit. She was begging for her life. This kind of, I think you implied the very first time in the bedroom. And did that really hurt your credibility? Because it did turn out that there was no evidence in the bedroom, and a lot of that stuff happened maybe in the garage. Or was that a mistake?
I wouldn't have done it that way again. Although I'm allowed as a prosecutor to comment on documents, as an example, that have already been filed in court, and by that time, Brendan Dassey's criminal complaint was already filed. I was reading almost verbatim from Brendan's criminal complaint during that press conference, trying to disseminate information to the people that was in court. I mean, it had become a very high-profile case. It was Steven Avery that made it high-profile. It wasn't the state of Wisconsin or even the kind of case it was, but he was made into this folk hero almost by the Innocence Project when he was exonerated a couple of years earlier, and so it was his celebrity that brought all those cameras into that room. It wasn't Ken Kratz that had done that, and what I disseminated was going to be released anyway. It was in a document, a criminal complaint, and it was going to be disseminated by the news. The fact, though, Jim, that the story came from my mouth during that press conference and not out of the mouths of, let's say the media that was covering it and reading from the complaint rather than me reading from the complaint is probably the way that should have worked. The exact same information gets disseminated, of course, because you weren't going to keep that from the public, but it wouldn't have been me saying those words. And of course, the allegations are just that. I mentioned that to the individuals who were watching the press conference, that it was simply allegations, that individuals like Brendan are innocent until proven guilty, and all the admonitions that I gave that I should have. But I can certainly see the reason why prosecutors should stay out of those situations, despite the clamoring for information. I had made it a practice not to comment on cases, which is kind of ironic because I'm viewed, I think, on this Netflix story as having embraced somehow the media. I hated that part of my job, and it wasn't something that I reveled in at all. That was the last, by the way, statement on the case in March of 2006 until May of 2007 on the Dassey case. So there's almost a whole year that goes without any comments on Dassey's prosecution. So I understand Mr. Strang and Buting like to talk a lot about we couldn't get a fair trial, but they probably don't tell you that when we interviewed all of the jurors beforehand, they're fully vetted. We get to ask them all kinds of questions. Two of the 16 15, that is the 12 jurors and 4 alternates, that we had 2 people even heard of that March 2nd press conference. And so all of these complaints to the contrary about how we couldn't get a fair trial and the media was so polluted with this information when only 2 people in the very city that it happened only had seen or even heard of this press conference. Your claims of the deck being stacked against you are just not in alignment with what the real facts of the case were.
All right, and we're going to get to the compelling argument you make based on forensics, ballistics, and science, but I want to get to the other major charges against the prosecution, and for his coercive confessions. And we have a guy that clearly is somewhat learning disabled at some extent, appeared clueless. His own lawyer, his own private investigator, looked like they were setting him up. He had that famous, I have a project due in 6 hours, in the 6th hour of that day. How can I get out of there? Jerry Booting talked about this Reed technique that police use that's psychologically coercive. What's your take?
Well, first of all, the Reed technique, and I'm not some kind of a shill for Reed and Associates who put this on, but they have been known as the gold standard for interviewing techniques for years and years, and their entire plan in setting up an interrogation begins with a non-confrontational interview process, and the officers did that. You got to remember, Jim, the March 1st interview was not an interrogation. He wasn't a suspect at all. Brendan Dassey was thought to be a witness and just a witness. And so when sort of these famous clips are harvested from the March 1st videotape where it says, Brendan, just tell us what happened. We already know what happened. We're going to stand with you. Those were all prefatory comments, Brendan, as a witness. Now think about the difference there. The reassurances that you're going to be okay, Brendan, we're going to stand by you, is mostly because Brendan Dassey himself is so afraid of not only the process but his Uncle Steven, of telling what Uncle Steven did. And at that point, the officers had no idea that Brendan himself was going to say that he was involved in the rape and murder. And so when you realize that some of these statements that the police made that certainly you'd never make to an interrogation subject, they're not nearly as egregious when you realize that this isn't an interrogation. It's not a defendant-centered or suspect-centered interrogation at all. It's a scared kid who knows much more than he is telling. 6 statements were made to the police. Only snippets of one of them were ever showed in Making a Murderer. So you have to take the entire field of statements that Brendan makes and put them all together, and then comment on them. There's nothing in watching the entire Brendan Dassey interview that the jury had concerns with. That is, the Brendan Dassey jury got to see the entire almost 4-hour video from start to finish of Brendan's statement, and they had little trouble in determining that Brendan's statements were statements against self-interest, that he had the opportunity to say nothing happened on many, many, many occasions, yet consistently says, I was there, I helped. And those, of course, are the 2 most important comments Brendan can make to place himself at the scene and, unfortunately, place himself in the middle of raping and murdering a young woman. So that's how Brendan and his statements come about and lead to his own conviction.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We're talking with Ken Kratz, the lead prosecutor, Making a Murderer, and we are now going to jump on and focus on, was Avery guilty of murder? Interesting. Let's start off first because the obvious thing is the guy has no motive. Not only does he have no motive, he's about to make potentially $36 million. Talk a little bit about what you saw as motives.
Well, motive is something we don't have to prove, of course, and the why he did it is something that only Steven Avery knows for sure. This was targeted. This wasn't a woman that just happened along, Jim. This was somebody that was lured on the property by Steven Avery. He called Auto Trader magazine at the very morning that Teresa Halbach shows up, asked for the same photographer who had been out there before to come back, that they had another vehicle that they wanted to sell. In about 3 weeks earlier, Avery answered the door just wearing a towel, and Teresa Halbach was very impacted by that. So Steven knew, in my opinion, that he couldn't just call Teresa directly, that she wasn't just going to show up. So he called Auto Trader using his sister's name, using his sister's phone number, using his sister's contact information, like her address. And although it's on the same property, it's same compound, if you will, the salvage yard where the property went. Teresa had been to that property, on 6 occasions, and so she had met with many of the Avery employees there, not just Steven. So when he hid from Teresa the identity, who it was that Teresa was going to be meeting with that day when she came out, that was intentional. Well, none of these are just happenstance or coincidental. He lures her there. He calls her 3 different times that afternoon, twice before she shows up, using the star 67 feature where he blocked the identity. Why do you do that? What are those 2 calls for when you block your identity? And then after Teresa's been there, after Teresa is likely either already having been killed or certainly not in a position to fight back, he calls once more time at 4:35 p.m. Does not use the star 67 feature. Her electronics, you may remember from the book, are burned in Steven's own burn barrel about 20 feet from his front door.
I'll say 2 other things on this, and then
her camera and things. But the point is, which is never mentioned in Making a Murderer, but he calls it 4:35. Does not use star 67 because Teresa's never going to answer her phone. So he realizes that, and all of that becomes very clear. And much of that, what I just told you, was not included, though, in the Making a Murderer documentary. And
I'll say 2 other things because I want to move on. He apparently, you report in the book, in prison, talked about torturing, killing, mutilating as I part of his anger after being falsely imprisoned. And he bought, this may have no link, but coincidentally, he bought handcuffs and I guess leg irons and things that would appear to be for sexual masochism, whatever, the day before October 10th. Now quickly go through, because this also could not be entered in, but it really shades your view. He has a history of domestic violence, rape. Go through some of that quickly.
Well, Steven Avery's violence towards women is something that, again, the Netflix series never tells you about. He never talks about the physical abuse of his wife, Lori, where she indicates to law enforcement she was lucky to get out of that relationship alive, where not only he demonstrates his controlling behaviors, but physically and otherwise psychologically abusive. When he goes to prison, he sends Lori many letters, including to the children, indicating his intent to kill her and to do terrible things. And so his hatred towards women, especially women that he knows or at least is in relationships with, is pretty clear. He then gets out of prison, begins a relationship with Jody Stokowski. Miss Stokowski has indicated that for their entire relationship, she lived a life of hell, of being physically abused, of being controlled, of being screamed at and walking on eggshells. That, of course, is exactly opposite of the cuddly Steven Avery that you would think existed from watching the show. And so it doesn't, of course, mean that he's a murderer, Jim, but my major concerns about portraying this man as being lovable or cuddly or, perhaps was somebody just in the wrong place at the wrong time, just isn't true at all.
We're going to have more on the murder case against Steven Avery coming right up. We're back with Ken Kratz, the lead prosecutor against Steven Avery in the Making a Murderer case. Ken, he told some big initial lies right after this happened about whether Teresa was even there. I never knew this. Talk about that.
Well, initially, Steven Avery was going to say Teresa never showed up. He told his brother, he told a friend that day on the 31st of October that Teresa didn't show up. He stayed with that narrative until at least the 3rd of November when he was telling whoever would ask him whether Teresa showed up that day. He said no. He even called her employer, Auto Trader, indicating she didn't show up, that they needed to reschedule the appointment. And so you think about behaviors like that, Jim, why and what explanation is there for an innocent person to call Auto Trader magazine saying Teresa never showed up if, in fact, she did, took the picture and left unaccosted as his final version came out. But he was advancing that initial story. He didn't know, of course, at that time that somebody had seen her walking towards the trailer. His very own nephew, Bobby Dassey, Brendan Dassey's brother, was looking out the window, saw Teresa taking pictures, saw her walking towards Steven's trailer, and 15 minutes later, when he left the trailer to go deer hunting that day, her SUV is still parked outside of Steven's trailer. Well, what's she doing there 15 minutes? There's no reason for him to taken a shower after she walked towards the trailer or come out and her car's still there, but she's nowhere to be found. These are explanations. These are events that are uncontroverted. That it's your own nephew saying this, yet the defense was able to, with the assistance of these filmmakers, convince millions of people that this never happened. Why would you disbelieve this witness? He has nothing to do with the case. He testified in a very uncontroverted way.
Did he deny initially? Did he deny initially, Ken, that there was a bonfire that night too?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, there's another big. Yeah.
Yeah, there's many occasions, and then that changes, of course, and his statement kind of morphs as he realizes what the public knows through the media, what the cops know through his statements with them, and his defense is kind of tailored as you go. Steven, even before Teresa Halbach's vehicle is found, is already chirping to the media. It must be the cops planting evidence, and it must be the cops setting them up. Of course, there's no crime here yet. There's no assertion that she's even been harmed, yet Steven's already advancing what's going to be his defense. That is that it must be the cops setting me up for something that happened.
And interestingly, he told them that he was home alone when saying Brendan Dassey would have given him an alibi. So very interesting stuff.
Yeah, when your alibi is standing right next to you, when Brendan was going to be interviewed, Steven Avery was scrambling trying to find Brendan a lawyer. He was calling his mom. He was calling his sister. He wanted to call the public defender's office directly.
Interesting.
Why would you want to keep your nephew quiet, the one who ostensibly is the holder of your alibi? Of course, he's afraid what Brendan's going to say. If he tells the truth, Brendan's going to talk about rape and murder and disposal of a body, and he doesn't want that, so he does everything he can to keep Brendan from talking to law enforcement. That wasn't successful, of course.
Okay, we're going to get into the planting of evidence charge. Now, you do a great job on the science. There were 6, I think, samples of Avery's blood found around in the car, I think, mainly. Talk about that.
Steven Avery's blood is found inside of Teresa's locked SUV. There's only one way, well, there's 2 ways that blood can be planted there, which was the defense theory, that is sprinkled around the inside of the vehicle through some tube of blood or something that the cops may have in their pocket that they're carrying around, or it was deposited there through active bleeding. Steven had a deep laceration in his right middle finger. He was bleeding in his own vehicle, that is in his Pontiac, which was on droplets of blood, just like on the inside of Teresa's vehicle. So he's actively bleeding. You know, all these theorists, these conspiracy theorists about planting, they forget that in Steven's own car, he's bleeding the same way that he was bleeding in Teresa's. Did the cops plant that blood too?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so those little things don't make any sense when you know the whole story. And of course, the Netflix documentary purposefully doesn't want you to know the whole story, because then it all makes sense.
In fact, Ken, one of the really strong cases to me that you built on the blood is that there was drip blood, which is generally from a cut, as you say, but there was also sweeping blood from where obviously he tried to turn the key ignition on. And, you know, in other words, the planting had to be done pretty sophisticatedly and in different methods of getting the blood out there.
And so why would, if you're going to plant evidence, why would you plant it in this kind of passive gravity droplets, but also contact transfer? Why would there be this, this cast-off kind of blood there? Why would you have it deposited in at least 3 different human mechanisms instead of just one way? And why in so many different places? Why 6 different places inside the blocked SUV, unless you've been working in there to hide the body, and you've been working in there to kind of clean up and hide the vehicle itself? And so all of these things are incredibly compelling. With any other defendant, Jim, you look at all of this evidence and say, my goodness, it's a slam dunk. This guy absolutely did it, except for what we call the big lie. That is, when you tell a lie, like evidence was planted and the cops are crooked, when you tell it long enough and loud enough, people start believing it. And unfortunately, because of and with the assistance of this documentary, that's exactly, I think, what the general public, at least around the U.S. and elsewhere, believe, that our Manitowoc County law enforcement officers were somehow crooked or complicit in setting this guy up for murder, and that's just the furthest thing from the truth.
And of course, there was no EDTA found, which would have been in the vial if it was one used from the 1985 case. Let me ask you this. Can you plant bloodless DNA? Because I also found it pretty profound that they found on the hood latch that Brendan Dassey had told them about, they found sweat DNA, which obviously to me sounds very hard to plant. And with that, can you explain why would Avery wanted to cut the battery cable anyway?
Well, first of all, there's no such thing as sweat DNA. Sweat it does not contain DNA. What does happen, though, is that your skin cells from your hands slough off, and it's the skin cells themselves, but it's non-blood DNA, and that's, of course, important. There's non-blood DNA on the hood latch, non-blood DNA on the key, and these are all indicative of a person with sweaty hands touching either the hood latch, which, by the way, you have to, unlatch the hood from the inside of the vehicle first, pop it, then you got to go out and stick your hand underneath the hood. Well, how does that happen? If it's not you doing that, how do you get some DNA on there? You don't have officers walking around with vials of Avery's sweat, vials of his blood. So it's ridiculous. It's, again, almost humorous, except for the fact that Mr. Buting and Mr. Strang said these things at trial with a straight face and got lots of people, at least in the public, to believe it. What they didn't get, though, Jim, is the jury to believe it, because every time they got to bring up some nonsense in trial, I was able to, with evidence, blow that stuff out of the water. It just didn't happen.
Why would he have tried to cut the battery cable? Because you make a good case about why the key was kept, because you wanted to have the thing compacted and drive it over there.
When you are going to crush a vehicle, and that's, of course, what our theory is that he was preparing the vehicle to be crushed, you have to take out the battery cable, you got to take out the gas tank and the tires and some other things. So part of it's preparing the car for crushing, but also... But
didn't he have to drive it there first?
Sure. Well, he was right. It was there, and the vehicle was stored very, very close to the car crusher, but it was also close enough that it could be easily driven over there, but it couldn't be just pushed or something over to the car crusher. So he would have to have driven it one more time, and that's why, of course, the key was kept in his bedroom because he still had to.
So he was going to reattach the battery cable?
Yeah, he was just going to put the battery cable back on, drive it over there, prep it, and on that Saturday, the very Saturday that the vehicle was found, he had intent to come back that afternoon and to crush that SUV.
Okay, let's talk about the bullet now, which again initially wasn't known until I guess they kind of got it out of Brendan. But her DNA was found on the bullet. Talk about the garage.
After Brendan's statement on the 1st of March, this is 4 months after the investigation had concluded, at least at the scene, Brendan indicates that the shooting happens in the garage, that the shooting her in the head and in the body with, by the way, Brendan identifies the very weapon that's used, the .22 caliber rifle hanging over his uncle's bed. You know, the cops didn't provide that information to Brendan. He provides, of all the weapons seized on the property, which exact weapon was used because it ballistically matches up to the bullet that was found. So he was accurately able to tell us that, and that the shooting happens in the garage. Well, with that, we got a search warrant on the 1st of March, came back to the garage location and pulled all of the stuff out of the garage, and 2 bullet fragments were found in the garage. One of them was a nearly intact bullet fragment that had passed through Teresa's body. Her DNA is found on that bullet, number one. Number two, again, what you never hear in Making Murderer, that bullet is ballistically matched to the gun hanging over Steven Avery's bed, his rifle that's hanging over his bed, to the exclusion of all other guns in the world. That bullet came from that gun. So the bullet that comes from Steven's gun, at least the one that's hanging over his bed, it passes through Teresa's body, and so that is, pardon my obvious pun here, but that is the smoking gun. In the case, that's what connects Teresa Halbach, her DNA, to Steven Avery, and there really isn't at that point any talking your way out of that. The jury understood that. The jury knew that we did a terrific investigative job, presented the case very clean, very, very well. And again, it's not until the movie is put together that any doubts are thrown on this conviction at all.
All right, and I'll say also that they apparently bleached the floor to try and clean it up in the garage, and bleach was found on Brendan's jeans. Let's do the bones quickly. The defense saying that the bones were moved to the pit behind his house. How do you know they weren't?
Well, there's steel belts that were burned in the bonfire when the body was burned. There are small fragments of bone, hundreds of them that are found in the burned pit area. Some of those bone fragments are so fragile that if you touch them, they just about turn to dust. And so these bone fragments are intertwined in the steel belts. That happens, experts said, when the body is burned at the same time as the steel belts, and as things are all kind of stirring up together, if you will, as the body is burning, the bone fragments can get lodged in or stuck in between the steel belts of the vehicles. And so we've got photos of, and during the collection of this, photos of these bone fragments inside or intertwined in the steel belts. Well, that can happen, Jim. If you're moving, bones from a different location to there, you can't take these little bone fragments as if, the junkyard dog who is patrolling that fire pit area wouldn't be barking its head off and all those other things that you have to suspend common sense and reality to even think of a scenario in which the cops could have taken these hundreds of bones from this innocent 25-year-old and as the defense really boldly suggests.
And there's some nice pictures in the book. There's some good pictures in the book which show the wires intertwined, so that makes a pretty good case. I want to move to the key now because, of course, one of the big issues was that the Manitowoc cops were not supposed to be around because of the rape case, the decision that was coming, and the defense says, hey, this key was found on the floor after all these searches. What's going on here?
Well, the defense claims that there were maybe 6 or 7 different searches of the inside of the trailer. That's not true at all. After the initial search for Teresa, when they did a sweep of the trailer and got some major obvious items of evidence, officers came back into that trailer on maybe 5 different occasions in the next several days in what were targeted entries. Officers would go in for a specific thing, to get the gun, if you will, or to get the computer or some documents off the table. These were not searches of the inside of the trailer. They were simply entries to collect items that each day the detectives thought might be important. Then before leaving the trailer, before leaving the site, they had envisioned one final thorough search of all the buildings, but the trailer including. And at that time, you'd go through all of the drawers, all of the shelves, taking items off all of the little shelves and looking in every nook and cranny. And it wasn't until that time that in moving this bookcase around that the key falls from a shelf in the back of the bookcase. We have photos that would show the jury and the actual cabinet itself, where there's about a half-inch gap in the back panel of the cabinet that you can see where gravity caused the key to fall down. So it's nothing. It's nothing nefarious at all. It's gravity that causes the key. It was found exactly when it should have been found. That is, it was found at the time when the drawers and very thorough search was being done. And so, unless you want to try to fit this round conspiracy peg into this square hole, usually it's a very innocent explanation for something like
that. Now, his
DNA
is found on the key, but none of hers.
Right, and there shouldn't be.
There should not be?
No, the expert Sherry Culhane testified, in fact was asked this question in trial, about that very thing. She said that when 2 people touch an item, it is likely the last person to touch it whose DNA will find on it. And so this is something that the crime lab knows. They know what to look for. They expected one person's DNA. If there was a mixture, where they would have reported that, but there wasn't. Steven Avery was handling that with his sweaty hands, left off his skin cells onto that key, and is found in his bedroom. Very damning evidence, of course, Jim, and that, with everything else, led to his conviction.
We'll talk about how Ken Kratz has been harassed from the case and what's next for Avery in our final segment. We're talking in our final segment, Ken Kratz, lead prosecutor in the case against Steven Avery, the Netflix hit series. Tell us, have you received death threats and things like that? And, of course, you suffered a big downfall after this. Give us a little thing about where you're at and how you turned it around and how you're dealing even with Amazon reviews that are going after you.
Well, after the Netflix series was released in December of 2015, I was the only person from the prosecution side. There weren't any law enforcement officers or other prosecutors who stood up and said, this is wrong. I felt it was important to stand up for the conviction, to stand up for Teresa and for her family, and to say what you're watching just didn't happen. And so, as often as I could, I would mention this is just wrong. This isn't a documentary at all. Documentaries are supposed to be truthful, or at least present what is akin to what was shown to the jury, and that just wasn't the case here. And so when I was actively speaking against the Netflix series, I received about 4,000 threatening or harassing emails and phone calls. Got so many calls at my law office at the time that it jammed my phone lines. I wasn't able to do regular business. I got packages sent to me. One of them exploded. Many of them were, very vile, very specific threats about raping my daughter and holding me and making me watch and the like. And, that kind of cyberbullying that happened and what you hear about happening to some people, I never knew that they, meaning the supporters of Steven Avery, could be as organized and able through just harassment to run somebody out of business, but that's exactly what they did. As the prosecutor from 10 or 11 years ago, they felt I wasn't punished enough, I suppose, for my involvement in the prosecution and worked to get me out of business. They were successful, unfortunately. My clients didn't want to have me represent them anymore. They didn't want the harassment. They didn't want all the attention. I had cops escorting me, following me around, my law firm and around my city, and had my vehicle damaged, and people showing up at my office in a threatening manner. And so it was very disruptive. I think it's cruel to kind of target somebody and to go after them just for having done their job. But I made it through. I realized I had to keep pointing out this new scourge on the justice system, which is innocence fraud. It is those that, in the name of innocence or innocence projects, will misrepresent facts to the court, misrepresent facts in a post-conviction or other process, anything to get some of these guys out of custody. And whether you talk about the Illinois case of L. Story Simon or North Carolina with Gregory Taylor, some of the cases that are now just coming to light, it's a horrible thing that the justice system is being subjected to. That is, people in a post-conviction way getting others out of prison without them actually deserving to be out, without them actually being innocent. It's kind of a little cottage industry now, and something that I've started looking at.
Okay, our last couple of minutes here. Is it right that Brendan Dassey, even if he's guilty and he was involved, and you make a great case on that, that just the nature of between his intelligence, his lack of support by his legal counsel, that it should be vacated?
Well, no. Brendan Dassey, we gave a terrific plea offer to. Brendan would have been out of prison in as little as 15 years, like 4 years from now. But it wasn't his attorneys who talked him out of taking the plea bargain. It was his own family. And when you have his own family telling him, don't take this plea bargain, not so much because of your case, but it's going to hurt your uncle's chances, Steven Avery's chances of acquittal at trial, that's a horrible position to put a 16-year-old developmentally disabled kid into. I've got a lot of sympathy for Brendan Dassey. When he rejected our plea offer, when he said, you're going to have to try me and convict me, well, that's exactly what we're left with. Brendan Dassey was there. He did help. He did have choices to make. He could have saved Teresa's life. He could have called the police, told his parent, told somebody, that this girl was being held captive and being raped and eventually murdered. But he chose not to. It's unfortunate. Steven Avery made Brendan Dassey a murderer. It wasn't the state at all that did that. His uncle had cajoled him and had invited him at every turn in this case. And even afterwards, he was convicted really because of Steven's case, not because of his own.
What I thought was interesting, Ken, is I don't know if you meant this or not, but the Making a Murderer title actually applied to making Brendan Dassey a murderer.
Well, that's exactly right. Yeah, and we point that out in the book. That's the murderer that was made was Brendan Dassey.
I'll never understand why Avery would have brought him in anyway. It would seem a risk, if anything. What's next for Avery now?
Well, Avery has to rely on Kathleen Zellner, her finding some new evidence that justifies a new trial. It didn't just have to be new evidence, but new evidence that would have mattered, Jim. So the bar is set really high. After you've exhausted all your appeals to be able to reopen a case with new evidence, it has to be very, very strong. I don't think that they can find it. Kathleen Zellner has been promising the disclosure of evidence that's going to spring her client for well over a year now. We've yet to see anything other than tweets and hyperbole coming from the Zellner camp. So until I see something solid, I'm not going to believe that they have anything significant enough that's going to warrant a new trial.
All right, and just in under a minute or so, obviously you took a real beating on your reputation and your marriage, job, life savings with the issues that you had, which you fixed. Tell us where you're at now.
Well, I'm doing really well. I'm retired from the active practice of law, but after making a murder, I involved myself in some addictive behaviors. I went to treatment, got myself right, and after all those years, I'm in a really good spot. Very, very happy, although I'm not practicing. Talking to the people like you, going to CrimeCon in Indianapolis this coming weekend, and I've been invited to speak in lots of different places. So I will keep beating the drum as far as not only this conviction, but the whole issue of innocence fraud, and that cases and documentaries and things that you watch on TV, may not be true. And I'd encourage everybody to take a deeper look into cases when they have an interest in these kinds of things.
And I'll say the book is a fast read, very well put together, and makes one heck of a compelling case. And also you mentioned, too, that we don't seem to much bring out that there was a victim here who lost her life, Teresa Hallback. She doesn't get enough focus at all.
Yeah,
but
she's the one and only victim here, and we can't forget that this young, innocent 25-year-old lost her life because of his behavior.
Well said. Thanks to Ken Kratz. That book again is Avery, The Case Against Steven Avery and What Making a Murderer Gets Wrong. Our next show will look inside the latest on the honeymoon cruise death of Greenwich resident George Smith IV, who actually the family is convinced was a victim of foul play on his honeymoon cruise. Thanks to Ken Kratz. See everybody next Monday on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.